Hello, and welcome to Fathoms, exploring the world in the whale. Tonight's event is streaming to you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders and First Nations communities of all lands this broadcast reaches. My name is Veronica Sullivan. I'm the Wheeler Centre's Programming Manager, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's event and our wonderful host. Rebecca Giggs is one of the most exciting Australian non-fiction writers at work today, and we at the Wheeler Centre are so thrilled to collaborate with her on bringing this experimental digital scavenger hunt to your screens. Rebecca does much of her writing on Noongar Whadjuk country in Western Australia, but tonight she's joining us from London. Rebecca's writing focuses on how people connect with animals in a time of technological and ecological change. Her incredible debut book is Fathoms, The World in the Whale. It's a book about whales, but also about how our human lives connect to remote wilderness and wildness. And it's out now through Scribe Publications. Please seek it out through your local independent bookseller. The formal component of tonight's event will go for around 30 minutes, after which there will be time for viewer questions. If you have a question for Rebecca, you can submit it via Twitter at any time during her presentation by tagging @WheelerCentre or using the hashtag Fathoms. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can also submit questions through the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll pass them on to Rebecca. We will provide a list of resources and works referenced tonight on the Wheeler Centre website at the conclusion of the event, if you're curious to find out more about any of the footage or audio you experience. For now, please put your headphones on, sit back and enjoy exploring the world in the whale.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here. I'd wanted, of course, to be with you in a room this July. It's a challenging moment to have a debut book out in the world. But rather than duplicate the experience of doing an in-conversation event, the Wheeler and I have decided to bring you something that's quite a bit different this evening. Throughout the writing of Fathoms, I kept a sort of digital pinboard with images and sounds that I referred to during the drafting process. And over the next half hour, I'd like to share with you some of those images. I'm always fascinated to learn from other writers what it is they keep on their desks or what files are scattered across their desktops during the writing process. So it's in the spirit of that notion that this event proceeds. I'm going to begin with a reading from the opening chapter of Fathoms. This is a part of the book that describes the bewitching afterlife of whales in the open ocean. If whales that expire mid-ocean are not washed into the shallows by the wind and tides, their massive bodies eventually sink and simultaneously decompose on the descent. This disintegration is called a whale fall. Afloat at the beginning, they're pecked at by seabirds, fish, swimming crabs and sharks attracted by scent trails to the carcass. Carrion eaters debride the underside of the carcass. In calm weather, ripples divulge the scavenger's thuggish toil, creating the illusion, perhaps, that the dead whale still trembles. This part takes weeks, a month. Over dusk's shift-change hours, daylight creatures rotate with nighttime meat-eaters. Some species of cetacean turn out to be much more buoyant than others. Deceased sperm whales will hang off the oil-filled chambers contained in their huge blocky heads at the surface, longer than most, though they're one of the largest and heaviest whales. But in time, any whale will go down, all the way to the seafloor. A dead whale slips below the depth where epipelagic foragers can feed from it. The whale's mushy body decelerates as it drops, and where pressure compounds, putrefying gases build up amid softening tissues. It drifts past fish that no longer look like anything we might call fish, but resemble instead bottled fireworks, reticulated rigging, and musical instruments turned inside out. The whale enters the abyssopelagic zone. No light has ever shone here for so long as the world has had water. Entering permanent darkness, the whale passes beyond the range of diurnal time. Purblind hagfish sink, jawless, pale as the liberated internal organs of other animals. Jellyfish tie themselves into knots. The only sound is the scrunch of unseen brittle stars eating one another alive. Slowly, it is very cold, hell's gelid analogue on Earth. The hagfish rise to meet the carcass and tunnel in, lathering the passages they make with mucus. They absorb nutrients right through their skin. The whale body reaches a point where the buoyancy of its meat and organs is tethered by the force of its falling bones. Methane is released in minuscule bubbles. The ballooning mass scatters skin and sodden flesh below it, upon which grows a carpet of white worms waving upwards like grass on its grave. Then, sometimes, the entire whale skeleton will suddenly burst through the cloud of its carcass. For a time, the skeleton might stay hitched to its parachute of muscle, a macabre marionette, jinking at the spine in the slight currents. Later, it drops, falling quickly to the seafloor, into the plush cemetery of the worms. Gusts of billowing silt roll away. The mantle of the whale's pulpier parts settles over it. Marine snow, anonymous matter ground to grit in the sun-filtered layers of the sea, sprinkles down ceaselessly. The body is likely to settle far deeper than any living whale will ever descend to see it. Rat tails, sea scuds, more polychaetes and eel pouts appear. No one knows where they come from. Opportunist octopuses bunt between ribs. Sightless, whiskered troglodytes like ginger tubers burrow into the surrounding sediment, which is blackened with fat and whale oil. From the dark come red streamer creatures that flutter all over. Colorless crabs, their delicate gluttony. Life pops. It's as though the whale were a piñata cracked open, flinging bright treasures. On the body gather coin-sized mussels, leucinid clams, limpets, and crepitating things that live off sulfate. Over 200 different species can occupy the frame of one whale carcass. A pink, plumed tube shrinks back into the Gothic column of its name, the ossidax, Latin for bone devourer. Mouthless and gutless, the ossidax is nonetheless insatiable. It eats through its feet, which extend like trickling roots into the marrow. The remaining bones of the whale fluff up with silver-white bacteria so that it appears as if the skeleton is draped in meters of downy toweling. And there the bones stay, lashed softly by microbes. Decades pass, 100 years even, before nothing remains, only a dent that holds the dark darker. The scientific name for the order of mammals we know to be dolphins and whales is cetacean. It's a wildly diverse set of mammals that range from the largest creatures ever known to live on the face of the planet, in the blue whale, to the extremely rare vaquita, a dolphin that has sooty eyes and is no larger than a hotel bar fridge, and of which there are only thought to be 12 remaining individuals today. A blue whale's heart can be heard drumming up to 3 kilometers away underwater. It's that large and that loud. A vaquita's heart beats so fast that they're known as the hummingbirds of the cetacean world. And of course, that specific sound is fading today as a result of pollution and marine debris. These animals, whales and dolphins, range from the poles to the tropics. But the whale that I first fell in love with was not found in the ocean. Instead, it occupied the top floor of a building several stories high in Perth. Before I'd ever encountered a whale alive, I'd seen how a whale ended. The white bones of the WA Museum's whale seemed radiantly mysterious to me as a child, an invitation to imagining the enveloping creature that had once belonged to these bones. The history encapsulated by this whale in the museum was meant to be evolutionary and natural. As a blue whale, it was meant to stand in for all of its kind, a kind of biological archetype. But only in researching Fathoms did I come to look at the social context in which this whale died. The whale met its end in Busselton in 1898, and it was preserved painstakingly by the action of an Australian scientist and curator called Otto Lipford, in tandem with two Japanese fishermen whose names are absent from the record. In an atrium on the top floor of the museum, the skeletons installation predated my existence. So I was always puzzled about how it had come to be squeezed into the building. It seemed much too large to get up the staircase, and at that point I don't think I could have conceived of it as being a dismantleable structure. The whale had in fact been lowered into the top of the building during its construction, so that the museum was itself assembled piece by piece around the whale bones until the blue whale was entirely contained. Such care was taken to preserve and display the remains of this stupendous animal, which, seen here in 1971, was already 73 years post-mortem. But all the while, Australia was still whaling. Down in Albany, which is not far from where my mother grew up, huge sperm whales were still being dragged onto the forecourt of the Sheerness whaling station. And the oil of those immense animals was distilled and destined to end up in the tiny mechanisms of Swiss watches. And this is one of the contradictions that lies at the heart of the book, and at the core, I guess, of our shared history with whales. Looking at skeletons in museums reminds me now that the tendency to destroy individual animals might arise not out of greed or indifference or hubris, but out of a deep felt attachment. People in the past felt that something for this blue whale, and they expected that their descendants would or should as well. Even though all the ingenuity that it took to preserve this specimen overlapped with the industrial slaughter of whales. At the start of the 20th century, there are estimated to have been 239,000 Antarctic blue whales. But as the whale's bones are being put into the museum in this photograph in 1971, those numbers have decreased just down to 360 individuals. There are now around 2,000 Antarctic blue whales left, and the whale waits, a skeleton in the museum, waiting to reopen later this year. Here it is, and you may be able to see very faintly that the bones are still leaking oil underneath that tarpaulin, even though the specimen is now 222 years old. Many museums count blue whales as a centerpiece of their natural history collections, but only one museum has a blue whale taxidermy. In 1865, a blue whale calf beached, at this point alive, outside of Näset in Gothenburg, Sweden. The first act of its discoverers were to poke out its eyes because they said that it should not be able to see them, by which they meant it should not be able to see them killing it. This was a process that took 2 days. But after it died, the whale calf was taken apart and its skin was preserved using arsenic and mercury chloride before it was pieced back together using copper furniture studs. It had to be transported in sections. Even as a baby, it was still that large. And here we see the head being conveyed by horsepower to the new museum's premises in 1918. In this case, the museum had already been built, so they had to pull off a sort of ship in a bottle trick, whereby they hauled the whale in pieces through a hole in the wall. Here you can see it being put back together in the Hall of Mammals alongside these trophy antlers of moose, which were affixed to the surrounding walls. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Gothenburg whale's story is what it contained. The whale's mouth was remade to allow the jaw to hinge all the way open in the style of a grand piano, and its interior was decked out as a lounge with wooden benches and red carpet and a ceiling that was lined with blue muslin set with gold stars. On special occasions, the museum attendants served lunch and dinner and coffee inside the whale. And American tourists travelled to Gothenburg to have their photographs taken, praying in the fashion of Jonah confined to the Leviathan in the middle of the whale's belly. But in the 1930s, 2 lovers were caught in the museum inside the whale after hours, having consummated their passions in the whale's esophagus. And after that, the whale's mouth was permanently closed to the public. The chairman of the museum, in typically dry Swedish wit, made a statement on the closing of the whale that concludes, "We must be content with the fact that it was 2 citizens of our own city that enjoyed this privilege." Here is the whale today, and you may be able to make out the furniture studs that are along the bottom of its jawline. Though no one's permitted to go into it, it is still opened on the occasion of a Swedish election, which is a pun on the fact that the Swedish word for making a decision or having an election is very close to the word for whale. If in Gothenburg, going inside the whale was an opportunity for either pious reflection or furtive romance, in one part of Australia, people sought to go inside of whales for an utterly different reason, and that was to be cured. Near the turn of the 19th century, a medical hotel for a therapeutic whale cure sprung up in Eden on the south coast of New South Wales. And this poster advertises the activity. Eden had long been a centre for shoreside whaling in Australia, where humpbacks were hunted, as were melon-headed whales, right whales, blue whales. They were sometimes pursued in league with pods of killer whales that were rewarded for the hunt with pieces of tongue and mouth flesh from the whalers' quarry. The larger whales were sought for the oil that could be distilled from their blubber, but also for the balleens, which are sort of a bristly comb that some whales have in place of teeth inside their mouth. So imagine you had a mustache inside your upper lip. That was the thermoplastic of this age. It was capable of being remolded into all kinds of different consumer products. But beyond whaling, the greases and gases of a whale's decomposition were thought by many people in the surrounding region to help alleviate fatigue and rheumatism, as well as to help with chronic bad moods that accompanied those conditions. So people travelled to Eden to spend weeks bathing inside dead whales and their extractions. Even as a whale in Eden was a kind of storehouse of commercial products in the form of the oil and the balleens, it also amounted to a therapeutic entity. Whales and wellness have a long history. In these next 2 images, we see whalers from the Davidson family company at the Try Works, where the whales that they killed and hauled were broken down. In these cauldrons, Charlie Davidson sits inside one of those cauldrons. They were ordinarily used to boil down blubber. And these Try Works, they were a truly fetid environment, like an abattoir. But you can see he's having whale oil poured over his shoulders. And another man then gives him a massage as a remedy for the muscle pain. However pleasant that shoulder rub was, the smell would have been rancid, and the flies were surely ghastly, assailing these men. But it was nothing compared to the foul experience of actually bathing inside a whale carcass. And there aren't many digitized images of the whale cure, but here is one from the Trove collection, the National Library's collection. The New York Times reported on these whale bathers. The whalers dig a sort of narrow grave in the body, and in this the patient lies for 2 hours, as in a Turkish bath. The decomposing blubber of the whale closes around his body and acts like a huge poultice. End quote. Ultimately, in Fathoms, I wanted to provide a sort of alternate history of what it means to go inside the whale. You know, metaphorically, is it viewed as a space of reflection or a space of decision or a place where our culture is inadvertently archived? What are our responsibilities when we learn that now there's an inscription of human trespass inside whales in the form of plastic pollution that they've swallowed? You can draw a line, I think, between the Gothenburg whale, Eden's whale bathers, and today's shopping bag swallowing whales, which is to say that wonder and love for an animal can unfortunately cohabit with cruelty. And indeed, that's been the rule, not the exception. If we love whales, it is, I think, because something in us yearns for an encounter with mystery, with great, sovereign, autonomous nature that defies the way we experience the world. Some whales are thought to be equipped with magnetic sensors capable of feeling the magnetic forces of the planet. Others, it's supposed, can form a picture of the insides of one another's bodies by bouncing sound waves off their bones and organs, so that they see one another as though they were transparent clouds just moving between other clouds in the ocean. Some whales live over 200 years. It's barely on the edge of our imagining how that must feel. Here's the bioacoustician Chris Clark talking about how to locate whales amid polar ice.
When you're a human standing on the ice and looking out, you're confronted with some real difficulties when it comes to trying to find and follow whales. First of all, the air is very cold. The ocean is actually sublimating, so it's steaming coming off the ocean. So this temperature gradient causes mirages, and you will see flying icebergs, you will see flying whales.
Archival! Archival! Off the starboard beam! Archival!
So a whale will come out to breathe, and what will appear to you on the horizon will be this enormous black object breaking through this haze, and then it disappears again.
Is it real? You see it too?
Aye, we all see it. But that don't mean it's real necessarily.
It's so cold you can't smell. You're so bundled up you can't feel. But as soon as you put the hydrophones into the water and listen, it's an absolute jungle underneath the water.
Whales as mirages. In 2016, scientists discovered a wholly new species of whale that had never been identified before alive. And yet it had been hanging in an Alaskan high school gymnasium as a skeleton. It was the school's mascot. This whale you see in this picture is over 7.5 meters long, but it doesn't have a name and it's never been seen alive. From DNA analysis, scientists believe it's likely black in color, but no one truly knows. It lives outside of human knowledge, somewhere in the open ocean or in the deep sea. This next image shows an animal that's not a blue whale, though it shares the dimensions of a blue whale. An Icelandic whaling company killed it in 2018. It's half blue whale, half fin whale. And because it was a hybrid, it fell outside of conservation legislation. And that meant that its meat also could not be sold. It was kind of mystery meat. You might as well have been trying to sell the meat of a yeti. The animal is a chimera, and yet it exists. No one knows if there are more hybrid whales in the oceans now, but anecdotally, changes in ocean temperature do seem to be resulting in species encountering one another more frequently. So North Pacific right whales, which are terribly endangered, are thought to be capable of interbreeding with the more numerous bowhead whales. And people have seen half beluga, half narwhals as well. My favorite whale is this next one, the strap-toothed beaked whale. They're called the least understood group of large animals, the beaked whales. This one has black and white markings, not unlike a panda bear's. And you can see that the males possess this pair of flat tusks that as they age, slowly lengthen and wrap around the upper jaw. So it binds the whale's gape smaller and smaller. Therefore, they must learn to hunt smaller and smaller squid as they age, which they then suck through the tips of their beaks in the way that people eat noodles. But perhaps the most mysterious part of whale life is whale song. Whale song is adapting and changing to the 21st century sea. It's an aquatic environment that is sonically, chemically, meteorologically, and ecologically modern. A few years ago, scientists began to notice a drop in blue whale voices. Blue whale voices had gone down the equivalent of 3 white keys on the piano. And here we can hear that difference. This deepening of sound is not unique. Similar trends have been identified in groups of pygmy blue whales and fin whales found all around the globe. In 1 million recordings of different whale sounds, scientists found that scale shifts existed across species that never interact, never stray within earshot of one another. So whatever has changed doesn't seem to have a localized origin. There's a possibility that this is a good news story. Because of the biomechanics of how blue whales vocalize, the louder the sound they make, the higher the pitch. Today's Antarctic blue whales may be quieter and lower toned than in previous decades, simply because whale numbers are recovering. And so more whales are communicating over a shorter distance. But other explanations are less rosy. The whales may not need to waste energy being so loud because sound waves travel further in an ocean that's made more acidic by the absorption of carbon dioxide. And so if marine acidification continues, the sea grows to be a louder place, not just because human activity in the ocean is amplified, but because the sea as a medium becomes better for carrying sound. Recent monitoring of Antarctic blue whales has shown that during the austral summer, their pitch rises again. They increasingly have to use a more forceful volume because of the sound of breaking ice. Of course, this is a natural phenomenon that's been sped up and made more widespread by climate change. So the impacts of a warming climate may modulate animal sounds even in the remotest places where no ships go, where barely any humans subsist, and where the most thunderous notes come from the clatter of breaking ice. This is one of the most interesting pieces of research that I looked at for the book. Whales echo us more deliberately in captivity. This is how a wild beluga sounds. And in a moment, we'll play you the voice of Nock, a beluga who lived for 23 years under the remit of a US Navy surveillance program called Cold Ops, based out of San Diego. In the program, beluga were trained to respond to hand signals and spoken commands in the open ocean. And they were used by the military to recover inert torpedoes or to identify aquatic mines. During his training, Nock began to emulate the voice of his captors. In this recording, he sounds nothing like a whale should. He has very much more got a human diction in the waveform of his voice. One Navy diver described being told to get out of the water at a certain point by a voice that he mistook for one of his commanders, but turned out to be Nock, the whale. In these last 5 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about when we get too close to nature, how we can begin to love nature to death. Sometimes people kill cetaceans, dolphins in this instance, out of love, out of wanting to get a picture and wanting to personalize their connection to animals. Fathoms belongs to a tradition of nature writing that has tended to be written in the voice of an individual narrator adventuring into wild places and having encounters with wild and charismatic animals. I wanted to resist this to some extent by writing about the nature that we experience as crowds online. Because of course the environments we inhabit now are not just natural, they're also digital. And I was interested to think about the relationship between loss in the natural world and also the abundance of unpolluted environments and cute animals that we find online. Is this just escapism, or is it something more complex? In these images, which show people handling dolphins for selfie photos, I wanted to look past the potential for narcissism and see here what I think is a kind of agony for loving the disappearing and wanting to express that love and personalize a connection to the animal. I think that lacking a proper protocol to grieve nature and to express our love, to grieve for what's happening in the natural world in an age of mass extinction and biodiversity loss, we end up with these sort of pathological expressions of that love. But if we don't find in ourselves some kind of restraint, if we can't learn to love nature at a distance and grow to respect creatures that are uncute or ugly or unpettable, then we find that wonder in the natural world has to be faked. And I mean that not just in the sense of creating plastic nature to photograph, but also in faking the emotion within ourselves. I was talking to Ellen Cregan from Kill Your Darlings recently, and she said to me that her favorite line in the book refers to whales as reserves of emotion, and those emotions being associated with meeting nature on its largest dimensions, emotions like awe and humility and wonder. And this for me is the big takeaway from the book, that a whale is a wonder not just because it's the largest animal on the face of the planet, or because it's arrayed with this panoply of unusual senses, but because it calls us to account for something that is outside our ordinary daily life, far from places of habitation that we ordinarily live in. People feel something for whales. It augments their moral capacity. And more than that, I think we know that no one person can save the whales alone. It is a kind of community creating device of a kind. So I hope that this is kind of where the book lands, in making an argument with being engaged with nature on a planetary scale, and in feeling a connection of our lives to the lives of these animals, you know, out in the most remote wildernesses, these stupendous animals just out there breathing beneath the surface. So thank you for enjoying these images with me. We're going to turn to some questions with Veronica Sullivan from the Wheeler Centre now. So I think questions have been submitted by YouTube and Twitter.
Thank you so much, Beck, for that fantastic, fascinating presentation. It was such a joy to follow along and to watch. And yeah, absolutely, folks at home, shoot through your questions on the YouTube chat or just via Twitter. To kick us off, Beck, something that I was just thinking about towards the end there, I'd love to ask you a little, you mentioned sort of the narcissism potentially, or, you know, the factors that influence our attitudes towards whales and sea creatures more generally, and you know, you write a lot about the relationship between animals and humans, and particularly between whales and humans, or whether there is one, which is a long-winded way of sort of asking, why do you think we are so eager to project some sort of affinity or relationship between humans and whales? And do you, in your research and in your reading, did you come across any sort of sense of whether whales do have an awareness of humans, or whether there's any kind of reciprocity in the way that we might imagine it?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a principle called phylogenetic relatedness, which is arguably a grounds upon which people project charisma into other animals. We tend to want to see in animals humanoid qualities, and that's easiest where they are furry mammals that nurse their young close to the body, that have front-facing features, that have hands or paws that are capable of grasping onto objects or surfaces. Whales have none of those things. I mean, aside from the fact they do nurse their young, but they're not land living, they're not furry. Their eyes are antipodal. They're on the other side of their head. You rarely see like a front-facing gaze from a whale. And so it's unusual that we have, I guess, projected charisma into these animals. But when I talk to experts on scientists, but also people who photograph whales for activist campaigns, their argument was that what a whale really represents to people is an untrammeled nature that exists out there. It's pure wilderness, a pocket of the environment that we haven't incurred upon. And it's that sense of remoteness that makes them magic to us, remoteness and mystery. And so it's kind of doubly dissonant when we end up with whales that wash up full of plastic pollution. And that plastic pollution is increasingly not just marine fisheries junk, but also debris from food packaging, like literally from people's kitchens. It ends up inside the belly of a whale. And where this, wonderful symbol of remoteness and mystery is populated by domestic debris, we undo not just, we don't just do visceral harm to the animal, we undo the story that has really served us about hopefulness and the environment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We have a question that's come through, which I think it makes me think of Pinocchio and the kind of whale imagery in Pinocchio where he's swallowed by the whale. So this question is, if you were actually eaten by a whale, would you not suffocate very quickly? Can you survive inside a whale?
You cannot survive inside a whale. There are many, tall tales in lots of different cultures about people being swallowed by whales. Obviously there's the biblical Leviathan story, but we see this in traditional cultures around the world as well, that particularly those that are found on the coast, an anecdote about being contained within the whale. And interestingly, often the interior of the whale is a place of healing. The closest sort of scientific test of this story is that there is one anecdote about a whaler falling into a sperm whale's mouth. Sperm whale is really the only kind of species that has a large enough gullet to take in a human body. Most whales, although they have huge mouths, have pretty thin esophaguses, so they couldn't really swallow someone. Anyway, this whaler apparently, in the 19th century fell into a sperm whale, was swallowed, and then immediately that whale was hauled. But when he was chopped out of the middle of the whale, would have only been a few minutes. He was still alive, but his skin and his hair and his nails had been completely bleached by the stomach acid of the whale, and he wasn't breathing. So he was resuscitated by all accounts. That still might be a bit of a tall tale, but that's the one that I find most plausible in the literature in terms of people really being swallowed.
Fascinating. I love it. Thank you for such an informative answer to a slightly quirky question.
I love a quirky question.
We all love quirky questions, absolutely. Another question has come through from Gregory on Twitter. They say, I'm interested in knowing a little more about the smallest whale or dolphin. Where does it live?
In the Gulf of California, the vaquita, it's a beautiful little animal. There's been a lot of campaigns around saving the vaquita because the reason that it's dying is that there's another large fish that lives in its environment that is being hunted for Chinese traditional medicine. And in many cases, the fisheries are illegal. So they're using a kind of trap to catch this fish that is lethal for other kinds of wildlife found in the area. Vaquita can't sense these traps using their echolocation. They tend to just get caught up in them, or they're chasing those fish as well into the traps. Unfortunately, they're really sensitive animals. So if you try to catch them, they often have heart attacks because their heartbeat goes very fast. So the US Navy have been using dolphins to actually, like military trained bottlenose dolphins, to herd the vaquita into these environments that are, they're kind of like an open-sided swimming pool made of soft fabric, so like a paddling pool. But it's interesting that they're relying on other kinds of cetaceans to try to save this endangered cetacean, because of course the vaquita isn't scared by the noise of a bottlenose dolphin in the way that it might be scared by a human trying to herd it into a contained environment. So they caught two, both of them, no, one died and a calf looked pretty stressed, so they let it go. And at the moment, there will be maybe 14 left, if that. So it seems certain that it will die out in the next couple of years. The big message I take from that story is, despite the fact that we whaled for centuries and we took a huge amount of biomass out of the oceans, we didn't kill a species during that period. All of the whales that we hunted have, to varying degrees, begun to rebound. And it's still a sad and tragic story, but we need to be alive to the fact that we have killed cetaceans by way of pollution. We've killed the barge dolphin already. We're about to kill the vaquita. And so if you're interested in saving whales, you know, you have to really think more expansively beyond whaling to the questions of pollution.
Yeah. You mentioned, we were just speaking before the event, that a lot of people are asking you what they can do and how they can help. You know, people are reading Fathoms and sort of feeling a call to action and a desire to become more proactive and protective of whales. What are the kind of, what's the simplest answer to a very complicated question that you offer people?
I really think that it would be wrong of me to sort of dictate a set of actions that were universal to everybody. I think that with the scale of these changes, in terms of global environmental change, climate change, marine acidification, sonic change in the oceans, it can seem like an impossible problem. It can seem much too big. So I genuinely believe that the way to act is to start where you are, and everyone starts at a different place. You need to do a thorough accounting of your resources, of your privilege, of your communities, and really find a way to act that is in line with your talents as well, what you have that's exceptional, that, you know, and that might be something simple like, you know, you're really good with Google spreadsheets, or, and find a way to kind of engage with the environmental problems that you see that takes advantage of those talents. Because the way to stay engaged at this point in time is to find meaningful action and to find, a way to be useful that makes you hopeful. And that is on a kind of local level in your community, using your talents, using your resources. It might be something as simple as kind of trying to restrict the amount of plastic pollution you produce, thinking about some changes in your diet. But I do think it has to be communal. It has to be reaching out to your people as well and having conversations, writing letters and talking to others. So within the book, there are different kinds of strategies, and I encourage people to buy it and have a read and think about, where those strategies land in their own lives. But I'm loath to kind of dictate one, rule for everybody. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to start. It's about thinking about what you can bring rather than expecting someone else to tell you the answer for yourself.
And it's also like, to want to save whales now means you are engaged with a world perspective. You're not just against whaling nations or whaling fleets. You're thinking about the climate, you're thinking about global pollution. And, the fact that a bit of debris from the kitchen can end up inside a whale can seem really humiliating. But you know what? That means that you can act in a small way to prevent that happening as well. Your power to create change on an incremental level stretches that far. And that's also sort of amazing and should make us feel empowered as well.
Absolutely. We have a question that's come through from Lena, and they ask, could you speak more about potential outlets or new rituals to help people grieve for rarefying nature and promising responses to the extinction of experience?
What a great question. I mean, this was definitely a vibe that I felt in the opening chapter of the book. I talk about a whale beaching in Perth, and the different sorts of explanations people had for why whales strand. But the overall vibe on that beach, although it was sort of hard to put a finger on, was something like, here is the body to grieve. Like, we know that the ice caps are melting, we know that the oceans are warming, and that potentially we know that they're becoming more acidic. But because we can't sense it, and we can't, when we get in the water, we don't feel like it's more acidic, it doesn't taste more acidic, it doesn't sound noisier to us when we plunge our head underneath the water. It's very hard to kind of cotton to. And then when something as huge as a whale washes up on the shoreline, you suddenly have this feeling of like, oh yes, what I do is connected to the remote environments, and you're sensitized to that. And really one of the projects of the book was to think through whale senses, different kinds of experiences of sound, different kinds of experiences of vision, to understand the ways in which the change we bring upon the world is experienced by other kinds of animals. But as for grieving, I think that these things are still really emerging. I think that we will increasingly see, in the generation that's under me, we'll see ways to mourn loss, but also to celebrate attachment at a far remove. So, to have kind of touristic experiences of nature that maybe are more digital and less interventionist in the environment, and to, more kind of community-based experiences rather than sort of solo adventuring off into the wilderness. Because I just don't think that's going to be possible in the future. All aside from Antarctica, all wildernesses now are highly visited and highly trafficked. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's more of a digital dimension to this in the future.
Thanks, Beck. I'm conscious of the time, and we might have time for just one more question. What is the impact of plastics on whales? We've seen the impact on birds and fish consuming microplastics. But when you talk about, whales swallowing pieces of plastic, what actually does that mean for them physically?
So there's the old problem, which is they get bound up in marine debris. So on the exterior of the whale's body. North Atlantic right whales now are, in the words of one biologist, more contained than they ever would be in the zoo, because literally every individual of that species has been seen to have either scarring from having been wrapped up in fisheries debris, or to actively have bits of fisheries debris attached to it. And that, I think, is like, most people can kind of feel upset about a whale being contained in a zoo, or, after blackfish, of course, people are worried about killer whales in captivity. But the idea that in the wild they are contained as well because of debris should also make us conscious, I think, of what's going on in a broader context. They also swallow plastics. There's some evidence to show that they can live with quite a lot of plastic inside their stomachs. So, there's that. But then on the other hand, it depends what sort of plastic. So swallowing some ropes and some bits of sheeting, plastic bags, it's probably just going to sit in the gut. Swallowing a fragment of a hard DVD case, it's going to, scratch the throat and kill the animal, because it's going to lacerate the throat. So it's not often, like, it can have to do with not just the amount of plastic, but the kind of plastic that the whale is exposed to. And then there's the question of microplastics. So microplastics, tiny, tiny nanoparticles of plastic in the ocean. Basically, the problem with plastic is that it doesn't so much decompose as just shatter. So over time, instead of like being departiculated by microbes or UV radiation, it gets broken down into a kind of confetti that floats on the surface. There's another problem, which is that those microfragments, the confetti, are hugely absorptive of toxins. So they are a kind of fatty substance, and they take in pesticides that are kind of pooling on the surface of the sea, that are run off in rainwater. So not only are they kind of pollutants, as in they're hard to break down, they're also toxic. Whales are particularly prone to that kind of pollution because they themselves are really fatty animals. They have this huge envelope of fat around them, which is what enables them to keep a stable core temperature in their blubber. And so they're prone to taking on those kinds of toxins if they are exposed to them, in their ecology. So we don't have great studies yet on the effect of microplastics on whales, but we certainly know that there are phthalates in their blubber, and that would seem to be evidence of them having, consumed and perhaps excreted microplastics in the past. Sometimes that's not a problem until they start to get hungry, and then they break down their blubber for nutrition. And then they get re-exposed on the inside to the pollutants that have ended up in the fat. So it's a really complex problem. I think, the one thing that really struck me in the book is that the whale that's in the preface that has swallowed a lot of plastic, much of that plastic has come from the agricultural industry, and it's come from our desire to eat off-season food, so to have tomatoes in winter, or so I think even when you're sort of looking at fresh produce in the market that isn't kind of enclosed in plastic wrapping, it's worth thinking about the fact that if it's been hothouse grown, it will have demanded a lot of plastic in its production most of the time. It's an incredibly complex problem, but we're going to see more and more moves to sustainable farming practices in the coming years, I'm certain. So hopefully less plastic between the whale and its world.
Yeah, fantastic. I feel like you would just be able to answer almost any question that we can lob at you. It's amazing. And obviously people should buy the book. They should go to their local bookstore in person or online and get a copy of Fathoms, and they can find out the answers to these and many, many more questions for themselves. Beck, thank you so much for this evening, for joining us for London, and for just sharing your infectious enthusiasm and delight in Wales with us. It's been such a joy.
Thanks, Ronnie, and thanks to the Wheeler.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night.